the changelessness of God. Let's talk about it with author Craig Hefner on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here, and I say it every time and mean it every time. You always have a place at our table. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter is our executive producer. He's here. Matthew treats his body like a temple, the temple of doom.
I eat, therefore I am.
Our producer for this program, Jeremy, is in the little glass booth. As this show is broadcast, it's September the 2nd. So, Jeremy, happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
2 days early.
Thank you so much.
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John says he loves the 80s. I'll tell you, being the 80s in the 80s was fine, but just so you know, living in the 80s is no great shakes. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. When it comes to philosophy, George says a man's got to believe something. I believe I'll have another coffee. I think the original was a beer, but we don't want to offend our teetotalers. And Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy says one perk of getting older is scoring the senior discount at the tattoo parlor.
Did you say
Where
perk?
did that come from, Matthew?
Do you or do you not have a tattoo?
Nobody-
I do.
Okay.
Yes, you
I
do.
do.
That's
Yeah.
where that came from.
Okay.
Well,
I
everybody
get it.
ought to know that.
I get it.
It's never too late.
You're going to
Get
be
a
really
tattoo.
old and get one, people.
I'm going to stop by a parlor, and I'm going to do a heart with an arrow through it and mother underneath it.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Something original and awesome.
And when you
certainly
get-
camp.
And when you get to heaven, your mothers are going to say, Stephen, what have you done?
Good point. I forget about that. I'm not gonna do that tattoo. We have a interesting program for you today, and you're going to learn stuff you never knew before. You're going to hear words you don't use in your vocabulary, and you're going to think thoughts that you've never thought before. Because Craig Hefner is here. I told him he would sell more books if he changed his first name to Hugh, but that's another issue. He serves as head of school at Covenant School in Huntington, West Virginia, and his work has appeared in such publications as the International Journal of Systematic Theology, the Oxford Handbook of the Bible in America, and this new book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is called Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God, a modern defense of classical immutability.
Wow.
Wow. I was telling Craig off here, my major was philosophy. And I could hardly wait to get into this book. And I read the preface and didn't understand one word of it. So I told him that, and he laughed, and I knew it was going to be cool. He understands because it's the rubric of this broadcast when we have a scholar on the program to get the fodder way down low so the host can understand it. And Craig has assented to that particular rubric, and this is actually going to be a really fun program. First, Craig, thanks for being with us. I know how busy you are. You're running a school. That's crazy. I don't know how you
Absolutely.
have time to write.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it is a busy time, as many parents are thinking. School starts in 2 weeks for us.
I know. I can imagine what you're going
We're
through.
about to get quite busy. But no, I'm glad to be with you all.
Glad to have you. Yeah, I guess the first place to start is that probably a lot of our people aren't even sure who Kierkegaard is.
Yeah.
Would you kind of fill us in on him? Francis Schaeffer was a friend of mine, and I visited him at L'Abri, and he was at our church a number of times when I was a pastor. And he didn't think very highly of Søren. In fact, he said some really nasty things about him. And so my view, having listened to Franz Schaeffer, starts out being negative, and I think I'm going to have to repent of that after this broadcast. So kind of fill us in, tell us who he was and what he was about. And
that's a great question. Yeah, so many of us read Francis Schaeffer and thought, therefore, Kierkegaard must not be one of the good guys in terms of trying to be, do evangelical theology. And a lot of people thought that. And who am I to come on your show and disagree with Francis Schaeffer? So I want to be careful.
Well, he's dead, so you can go ahead.
That's true. Well, yeah, but your friend and someone much smarter than me. But he was writing, Francis Schaeffer was writing really general, like high level history story, right? And so he was trying to say, like, hey, there's some problems with modern philosophy, and Christians need to respond in a certain kind of way. Specifically recovering a rational argument, for the Christian faith. And he viewed Kierkegaard as not helpful, as part of the problem, because he thought that Kierkegaard gave too much away. That Kierkegaard's famous for the phrase "leap of faith," where you don't have any good reasons to believe in the Christian faith. You just kind of jump and take a dive in and go from there. And so a lot of us kind of conservative theologians in the evangelical tradition have never thought of Kierkegaard as somebody who might actually help us. But you asked more generally who he even was. So generally, big picture on Kierkegaard, he's a 19th century philosopher theologian. So he was born in 1813, died in 1855. He lived a really short life, but a very profound one. He was a Danish theologian and philosopher. He lived in Copenhagen. He wrote something like 30 plus books in his short life. He's called a lot of times the father of existentialism. That's what he's oftentimes known for, is kind of founding existentialism, in a lot of ways founding like psychology. He wrote books on despair and anxiety and things like this. And so he was a theologian at the same time, but kind of lived in a different world from us, both kind of philosophically what was going on around him, and he was in Copenhagen. So does that give you enough?
I don't, and I never to his face would have done that, but I disagreed with Dr. Schaeffer about Kierkegaard, primarily because Kierkegaard was a rebel. He kicked against the box. He was passionate, and he was disliked. Now, I don't have any of those traits except the last one, and I get criticized a lot. And so I always considered Kierkegaard, in fact, read him devotionally as a brother that I looked up to, and I never thought of him as being a theologian writing on immutability, but he was. What is immutability?
Yes. Well, he definitely was a theologian writing on immutability. So I think I point out in the first chapter that what theologian philosophers haven't noticed about Kierkegaard is that one of his last publications was this little sermon called On the Changelessness of God. And so if nothing else, you're your listeners of your program ought to at least go read that one short sermon that he wrote called "On the Changelessness of God." It's just this beautiful. It reads like a sermon. He didn't actually preach it, but it kind of has the feel of a sermon to it, and it was in defense of this idea that God doesn't change at all. And so, yes, immutability is just another way of saying changelessness, or God does not change in any way. So
Now,
Kierkegaard was a big advocate of that.
Use that sermon as sort of a template for looking at a lot of things that Kierkegaard had said?
Yeah, absolutely. So he seems to be saying in that sermon that the changelessness of God is really important to him. And then when you go back and look at his less directly theological works, you see him talking about questions like change and identity a lot. And there's themes of changelessness back there too.
Oh man, this is going to be a great hour. And immutability is important, man. Everything I know is changing. You know, everybody my age is either dead or retired, and I'm still working, and I hate every second of it. But the one place I can go, and the place where you can go to, is to a God who is the same yesterday and today and forever. The title of the book, but don't let it scare you, Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of the God we worship. Don't go away, because like Jesus, we're going to return. We're so glad you're here. We consider it a high and holy compliment that you spend a portion of your day with us. We're hanging out with Craig Hefner, and his new book is titled Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God, a Modern Defense of Classical Immutability.
Craig, would you do me a favor and start us off with just give us a definition of existentialism, and then as you move from that, how were Kierkegaard's existentialist beliefs rooted in his Christian faith?
That's a good question. Well, the can you define existentialism question is a pretty hard one. I don't know that I can really do that justice right now.
You could say whatever you want it to be.
Among the ones talking right now.
Yeah, consider who you're talking to, so it doesn't really matter. And you can give us the abbreviated one if there even is one.
If it's wrong, we won't know. So just keep that.
The real answer is I wish that I knew, and if I did, I would tell you for sure. But it's a really hard answer. In general, it's a kind of tradition of philosophy that asks questions like about identity and who I am, and does my life make any sense? And can I tell a story about my life that actually holds together? Is there anything that's meaningful? And so what it kind of means, like the word existential, is to go out, to exit, and to look back on yourself, and to do this kind of highly self-reflexive thing where you ask these kinds of questions like, am I doing anything that matters? Does anything matter? Does my life mean something? Is there meaning in life? Those are, classically existential questions. And so that's why Kierkegaard writes on things like anxiety, despair, and topics like that, because he's asking those questions. But specifically Christian. So I think someone made the comment, that generally existentialists are very atheistic. They don't go anyway in any Christian sort of way. But Kierkegaard, as you asked, Kathy, is a very Christian existentialist, and so he asked those questions, but he's trying to prod us towards seeing the Christian faith and the gospel as the solution to those things. So he will say despair is essentially something everybody's going to experience, but the way that you get out of despair is by resting, he says in The Sickest Unto Death, one of his famous books, is resting transparently in the one who established myself. And so he views rest as possible, but he, you know, he knows that despair is going to be a common human experience. So he wants us to ultimately land in the Christian faith as solving these existential problems we might have.
Huh.
Does that answer your question, Captain?
Yeah, for sure.
Great answer. By the way, he'd been there and done that. I think his love life was kind of ragged, wasn't it?
Indeed, and very complicated. Yes, as you can expect. Yeah, so he really famously had a fiance, and then broke off the engagement. But he did that in a very complicated way. So he
I
tried.
would say unchristian way.
Did he text her?
Yeah.
Send her a text.
He did not text her. His actual strategy is a quite interesting one. So he didn't want to hurt her feelings, and so his goal was to get her to break it off. Right? I mean, it's actually, I work among high schoolers. It's not that uncommon.
I've heard of this play before.
Yeah, it's a play. It's in the playbook. But he tried to get her to do that, and in all these convoluted ways, and then it didn't work, and he had to break it off. And then he never married. So he never married. He never had children. So he was, and in some ways, he kind of viewed himself as still attached to her in life. It's just a really complicated romantic world.
Yeah, it
But,
is.
you know. Yeah. Some people think that everything he's writing is a kind of secret letter to her. And secretly him trying to work out all of that. And I mean, there's some parts that are pretty clearly about the romantic relationship problems that he has, but there's a lot that's clearly not. So, good question.
Craig, I recently heard a phrase, a speaker was saying, I used to think of God as the one who has all the right answers, when in reality, God is the one who has all the right questions. Who told you were naked, or all the you're like, oh gosh, I guess he really did ask a lot. It really just kind of pinpoints you. So when you were saying that stuff about the existential questions of like, does this even matter? Is there any, like, that doesn't feel abstract or academic at all. That feels like a very approachable place to go. What does this all mean? You're like, that's a great place to meet God, is to ask those questions. And from what little I know, I would have read about Kierkegaard, and I'm just learning it's not Kierkegaard. I was trying to throw an extra R in there, so that tells you where I'm coming from. He wanted stuff being very applicable and practical seemed like to be a very important part of his makeup. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he talks often about how his whole like writing project is really a pastoral goal. He wanted to upbuild and awaken the Christians in his community. And so he viewed everybody in, you know, he lived in Copenhagen. It was a Lutheran state at the time, which meant that we forget how this worked and how tight it was. But to be a Danish citizen, you had to be baptized by the Lutheran Church. So they were just so connected, right? And so he viewed it as his contemporaries that he lived among, were just all kind of Christians by default, because they were born into Denmark. And so, they got baptized in the Lutheran Church, and they got their citizenship, and there was no real intention behind it. And so he has a really, as hard as he is, he had a practical goal in mind, which was to wake up his listeners who were just in this kind of slumbery, not taking their faith seriously, just being Danish more than Christian, and get them to actually think about it and ask hard questions like, are you sure that your life matters? Are you sure that you're doing the right things? Are you sure that you have faith in God? You know, or did you just inherit that from your family? And so he asked those hard questions that I think are that certainly are really, really practical.
They really are. And he was hypercritical of the church. And but that's because he cared. He described his Christian faith as passionate, and he was passionate about these things, and in our time would have a lot to say about the modern day church, you think?
I'm sure he would.
All right. Well, listen, the music comes in. When it comes in, there's a big flashing light in the control room that says "shut up."
Slowly.
Slowly, but take about 40 seconds before you shut up. We're talking with Craig Hefner. And if he had been my philosophy teacher, I would have done a lot better than I did.
All right.
His new book is called Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God, a modern defense of classical immutability. I know that sounds pretty deep, but this is an important, life-changing book. Mark that down. Glad you're with us. We're hanging out with author Dr. Craig Hefner. We were talking about social media, and you didn't sound very high. I was underwhelmed with your enthusiasm. But give us the website for the book and the website for the school in West Virginia.
Sure. Yeah, I've read too much Kierkegaard to be excited about social media.
Nice.
There you go.
Walks the talk.
He was very suspicious about the crowd and the masses, and if you were popular, he thought that was probably a sign that there was something wrong with you. So,
Jesus said something like that too. If all men say good things about you, you ought to worry.
But yeah, I'll take the moment to plug my school. So, as you said at the beginning, I'm head of school at a classical Christian school here in West Virginia, and our website is covenantschoolwv.org. We have a Facebook page too that's pretty active. So if anybody wants to track the school that I'm at, that's where I am. Awesome. And the book has a website too. It's with IVP Academic. So I don't know the code for that off the top of my head, but there is a website that IVP has for the book.
IVP is InterVarsity Press, by the way. If you're going to Google it, you could probably go with IVP, but sometimes Google gets that confused and you'll go to a porn site.
Or the person named Ivit.
Yeah, or somebody named
IVP.
Craig, we're sort of talking in the direction generally of the importance of like application versus just knowledge. And you had a point in here, Kierkegaard was preoccupied almost exclusively with the question of how the self relates to the immutable God, not what immutability is. Can you kind of take off from that point and expand on that?
Yeah. So generally, if you were to survey the doctrine of divine immutability and look at thinkers and theologians, there are exceptions, but generally what theologians do is define it. What is it? In what ways does God not change in his essence and his place and his knowledge and his will? In all these ways, God, that's a lot of work on what it is. Where are the biblical texts that justify it and so forth? So that's very much a what question about immutability. And unfortunately, for someone who's trying to research Kierkegaard, he just never does that. He never says, here's my definition, not very clearly. Instead, what I'm trying to say there is he's always and almost only talking about what does the fact that God does not change have to do with me, a constantly changing finite human being. And so that is to say he's very interested in how God relates to us and how it affects a person's life. So he just doesn't have as much of the philosophical interest in defining it, in my view. So I'll read a quick quote if I can. We should have some words directly from Kierkegaard in this segment, I feel. Can't hurt.
Not in
but
Danish,
it does give you a
please.
flavor. I'll do it in English if that's okay.
Oh, good.
Should we stand?
This is where he kind of unpacks that a little bit. So he says, this is in his Upbuilding Discourses. He says, God is unchanging, but this changelessness is not that chilling indifference that devastating loftiness, that ambiguous distance, which the callous understanding lauded. No, on the contrary, this changelessness is intimate and warm and everywhere present. It is a changelessness in being concerned for a person.
Oh man,
I love that quote.
that is
That
so
summarizes very good. That's and what he's saying there. I think most people have probably never heard, say, a sermon preached on divine immutability. In a lot of ways, that's because when we think about divine immutability, it's a doctrine that makes God seem very much far away from us, very much unlike us. And so it has this cold, distance, far away feel to it, because we don't know what it would possibly be like to not change at all. Our whole lives are about change and adapting to change and responding to change, right? And so Kierkegaard is so attuned to that, right? That he says, like, we tend to think of changelessness as this lofty God over there, far away from us, this distance that it puts between us. And in some ways it does that, but it's also about changelessness in being concerned for us, which is the positive, the how, now I can have a relationship to a God who doesn't change. That's actually a really positive thing when everything else in your life changes. That's what I think he means by being concerned with how immutability works, not just what it means.
And his theology is the formal study of God presents a God who is kind and gentle and gracious and merciful. I read Kierkegaard often in my devotional, and I'd be interested, what would you say to our viewers or our listeners who are thinking about, and they should first get your book, of course, that goes without saying.
Right.
But what would you recommend next?
Yeah, so if they get my book, it might help get me off of I think I'm like 1.4 million in the Amazon list right now. So we're crawling up.
Hello, 1.3 million.
1.3 after today.
Work on the second million. That's easier.
The Kierkegaard book I'd recommend is the 18 Upbuilding Discourses. That's what I would start with. It's a series of sermons, very Christian, very philosophical, and kind of gets you all you need to hear about Kierkegaard in one thing. So 18 Upbuilding Discourses.
So we're introducing you to a great philosopher, but it's not what you think. In fact, because of this program and because of Craig, you will rise up and call us blessed. Hey, we're so glad you're with us. By the way, I believe it was Kierkegaard who originally said, in this present age, the dizziness of freedom requires one to take the leap of faith and subscribe to the weekly Key Life email.
Oh, I'm sure.
And that's a rough translation in the English. So while you're thinking about it, do it for old Kierkegaard. Go to keylife.org/subscribe, and you'll be glad you did.
You're such a good sport for reading that, Steve. Let me just say.
How do you say key life in Danish?
Wait, we do or do not have Danishes to eat after this.
No, we don't.
I'm misunderstanding this. Craig, you're a good sport to put up with all this stuff. So, we're getting to know Søren. And anytime you get to know somebody, if you come across one of their favorite verses or favorite passages or books, I feel like that's kind of a deeper insight into who they are. And off the air, we were kind of talking about this in passing. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, about Søren Kierkegaard's favorite verse and why it was his favorite and what it meant to him. And what does it tell us about it?
That's good. So I have an entire chapter in the book on his favorite biblical text, which he says very clearly is James 1:17. And so there's a place in one of his journals that Kierkegaard wrote that James 1:17 is my favorite biblical text, a text that I return to again and again and again and always. So I have a chapter in there called Returning Again to James 1:17, and it's looking at why was this Kierkegaard's favorite biblical text? What does that tell us about what he thought? And of course, James 1:17 is the classic text that people cite in defense of divine immutability. So it's every good and every perfect gift is from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow or variation due to change. So that's James 1:17. If you're looking for one verse that says here is where it's clear that God does not change at all, that's generally been the text that Christians have gone to, and so it's interesting that that's his favorite biblical text. We could talk a little bit about why, but I'll kick it back to you. Yeah.
George.
Well, I'm interested in why.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, me too.
So I think that he was very sensitive to the way that changing circumstances could make your life chaos, meaningless, have no coherence. And he was just extra attentive to that and helps us see it because it's actually true. We just don't always realize it, So he was really concerned about the problem of change in his life and how it rendered everything meaningless potentially. So then when he encounters this biblical text that says, but there's one thing in the whole universe that doesn't change, and that is God, and he gives gifts to you, and he's the Father of lights who's constantly giving gifts. That verse just spoke to Kierkegaard, I guess, and helped him feel like, okay, everything is not change. There is at least one stable thing that I can fix my identity in life around and have some meaning. And it comes from God, the Father of lights, who's giving generously to his people.
Oh, man. I taught at seminary for a lot of years, and I taught a course called Communicating to Postmoderns. And if I had known you before I taught that course, I would have made this book a mandatory text for the course, because Kierkegaard would go today. I mean, people would listen to him because of his authenticity, because of his passion, and because of his worldview, which is expressed in a way that modern people today would be able to understand and groove on what he had to say.
Well,
yeah, that's right.
And maybe it's appropriate just to, we hear the references to modernism and postmodernism, and you make a point. I was kind of trying to locate it again, but essentially that, Kierkegaard's definition is in the classical modernism, but it still suggests the ultimate implications for postmodern perspective as well. I don't know if that's even intelligible enough to respond to, but
no, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Well, so like the story goes that like a modern perspective on the self is one that first starts off with rejecting God, but then tries to build an identity in self that can actually make sense and hold together. And so that's kind of characteristically the modern self, we might say, like I've got this, I can hold my life together, everything makes sense, I don't need God, I don't need anybody else. The postmodern response to that is to basically say none of that works. It's all your life is actually disintegrated, there's no coherence at all, you should just embrace kind of constant flux and change. And so what Kierkegaard helps us do is look at that and go, the modern thing was wrong in rejecting God and thinking it could have stability of itself. The postmoderns are still wrong for rejecting God, but at least they're right that the implication is that your life can't make any sense now. That really nihilism and despair is where you'd have to go if there wasn't a changeless God available to you. So I think that I hope that answers your question. It kind of helps us understand those like modern on modern thoughts on the self and postmodern thoughts, which the postmoderns tend to be a little bit
It's like
more
they have
despairing.
more integrity in their understanding the implications
Yeah.
in a sense.
I was
They followed it all the way through to the end, which is we don't have a changeless God in the picture now, so everything is change.
you know,
There's
I was,
nothing stable.
I was reading Reno, the editor of First Things this morning, and he was talking about how that most young people don't have a heavenly father or an earthly father, and that they're trying to do what you said to grow meaning out of it, and it's running out of gasoline. I think the perfect person to introduce to a young person who has run out of gasoline and is thinking about jumping off a building would be Kierkegaard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's I mean a lot of young, I mean, I found Kierkegaard in my 20s, and I think you're in your 20s at seminary and you're asking questions and you're not sure about a lot of things and you kind of have a little angsty edge. Kierkegaard is an ally in that, but he gets you back to Christian faith. He doesn't leave you there.
Yeah.
So absolutely, if you're haunted by those kinds of questions, Kierkegaard is a friend in the middle of it.
Craig, this has been a wonderful time with you, and I knew it was going to be exciting or stuffy, and I wasn't sure which. We'd love to have you on again. The title of the book is Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God, a modern defense of classical immutability. Don't let that title scare you. This is a dynamite and important book, especially for our time. And Craig, you get 3 free sins for being on with us.
All right.
Thank you so much. This has been a great hour.
Thank you all.
Guys, we're going to come back for a short time, tell you who we're going to do it unto next week, and you'll be amazed. Hey, thanks for spending this hour with us. And thanks for watching. If you didn't know, you can watch this show if you're listening on the radio on our Key Life YouTube channel. Now we have 8,000 subscribers and are growing. We fully expect to reach 1 million over the next 20 years, and for sure. And we're working on it. So check it out on youtube.com/Key Life Network. Guys, this was a good interview, and it was a really we laughed a lot and made fun, but it's really important material. We don't think much about a God who doesn't change, and if he doesn't change, we think that means he's angry and that his anger never changes. Just the opposite is true. That verse in James is so important. He's a father. And that means a lot of things: gentle and generous and wise and kind and merciful and loving and forgiving and protecting and providing and creating wisdom. That's the Father who never changes, and he's always that way. And there's probably not a better way to introduce that than a book like this one, and a scholar like Kierkegaard who believed that with all of his heart. I personally think that Søren had some significant emotional issues, significant. And I think the thing that held him together and made him so wise was exactly what we've been talking about on this program. I think he understood, and understood it profoundly, that when he knelt down and went before the throne, the same God that he had worshipped, that had loved him, that had upheld him in the darkness, would still be there. and still doing the same thing. And you can depend on that too, believe it or not. I have serious emotional issues, and I've been there, and I know. Kathy, who's going to be here next week?
Next week, our friend Jared Wilson, who has been on the program a number of times, is back because the man can't stop writing books, which is a good thing for us. But he's got a new one out that is just got a great title. It's called Friends with the Friend of Sinners. So it should be a great hour with Jared.
And he's always been a friend of sinners, always will be, and always was, because
He never changes.
he's immutable.
There you go.
That's right. Guys, we're going to do this again next week. It's our fond hope that you join us. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't, and that gives you a wide, wide berth.